An estimated 2 million Americans experience traumatic brain injuries each year. Such injuries occur every 15 seconds. While thousands die each year from their injuries, millions more are part of a silent epidemic. These injuries are internal and usually don't show on the outside. Brain injury has deep, tragic, and profound implications for the injured and their families and friends. It's common for survivors of brain injury to lose their jobs, homes, become bankrupt, and fall out of relationships with loved ones. A brain injury can happen to you or me at any time. Please listen carefully to the information in this program in case this sort of tragedy strikes you or a member of your family. Today's speakers, Jerry Gilb, David Goldin, and Michael Harris, think that the most difficult brain injury cases to prove in court tend to be those cases in which the injuries are characterized as mild and the survivor appears outwardly normal. This interesting interview centers on making the invisible injury visible so judges and juries understand the reality and severity of damages to clients. It's with a great deal of pleasure that we welcome today's speakers to this Brain Injury Speaker Series. On my immediate right is David Goldin, who is a personal injury attorney with years of experience representing clients with brain injuries. He's a graduate of Stanford University with both a JD and MBA degrees, and his offices are in downtown San Diego, California. On my left is Jerry Gilb, and he is a client of David Goldin's, and he received a serious brain injury in 1992 while shopping when a screen door fell from overhead. Prior to that, Jerry was the manager of several auto parts stores, and he is married and has adult children. And Michael Harris is an attorney who has practiced in the area of personal injury for 23 years, and he specializes in brain and spinal injury cases. He's highly regarded and was named Outstanding Trial Attorney of the Year by the San Diego Trial Lawyers Association, and his offices are in Encinitas, California. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. Please tell us a little bit about your injury and how it's affected your life.
Well, I was hit on this side of my head, or the top of the head, and from day one on, I've had headaches. I get, they say, easily overwhelmed. I used to really enjoy socializing, and I don't like to be around a lot of people that are, I mean, not because I don't like them, just it's the noise and the activity, and trying to keep up with the conversation is real difficult. And and I have always had a tendency to compete in my life, and I want to compete for that spot, and I can't do that. So that also includes my family. It's kind of when they have a big gathering, I don't really participate. I've learned to kind of dodge and go out of the limelight or go outside. You know, it's like it's affected every aspect of my life. At my son's wedding, there wasn't a whole lot of involvement on my part, as well as my daughter's.
Sure.
So it was things like that. I guess it didn't make it easy, but again, back to being social. I still do it. I still try. I mean, I'm out there trying to get involved with people and be a part of the real world, and it's going too fast.
And here you are up here today in a reasonably social situation, I think.
Yes, yes. As long as there isn't a whole lot of competition out there.
David Goldin, you represented Jerry Gilb in his cases. Would you say that his situation is common or typical of what we would call the silent epidemic of brain injury, and why the sort of the invisibility of the injury itself is sort of part of the problem?
Jerry is, as you can tell, a wonderful guy. And the name of this business from a legal standpoint, because this is a difficult business in what are called quote-unquote mild traumatic brain injury cases, is credibility. You don't have credibility of your client, and you don't have objective evidence to prove the case, and we'll talk about that a lot this morning, you just can't do it. So this is a very cynical environment right now out there in the legal courts, as I view it, especially when it comes to somebody coming in and seeking to recover damages, seeking to recover money. And when you don't, basically the jurors look at you. There's a great attorney in town who starts all of his talks by having a little pig on a table going oink, 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 oink for the attorneys to listen to and pay attention to, because that's how jurors are viewing the situation. So how do you have somebody who, I'm sure looking at Jerry, I mean, he's talking about his injury, but let's say he was talking to you about the weather or talking to you about the last, sporting match. It'd be very hard to get a real feel for the fact that this man is devastatingly hurt by these injuries. Moreover, it's true, and it's still true of Jerry, that he doesn't, it isn't something that's internal to how he feels in a certain sense. I mean, by that I'm talking about he feels a stigma from this, and it's involved, it's been a difficult situation for him to say. In fact, he told me, I know something's wrong, but I don't know that I want to call it a brain injury, and it's very understandable. And he felt a stigma from the lawsuit. This lawsuit was 8 years ago, 10 years ago. Injury was 10 years ago. The lawsuit settled 8 years ago. And he felt, he was in a small business. Small businessmen don't like lawsuits. They don't want to participate in it. So we'll talk about how you get around that. And by get around it, I mean being real. Because if you aren't real in these cases, if you go into these cases thinking you can do this case, but you don't have a real injury, or you don't have a credible client, then you're wasting your time and your money. Because these cases have to be real to make them cases that you want to handle from a lawyer's standpoint, from a client's standpoint. And unfortunately, and I'll talk about this briefly, the silent epidemic aspect of this, I was looking at some statistics from the Center for Disease Control that are put out by the American Brain Injury Association. And they use these statistics, as I say, gathered by CDC. Last year there were I'm not sure if it was last year, on a yearly basis there were 1.5 million traumatic brain injuries, as compared with the 4 or 5 other leading causes of injury or illness. It's MS, there's spinal, I think there are 10,000 a year MS, 11,000 a year spinal cord injuries, 45,000 or so HIV incidents, 176,000 breast cancer, and 1.5 million traumatic brain injuries. That's 6 times all the others combined. This is a real epidemic, and it's an epidemic that doesn't get realized at this level, at Jerry's level, where it can be as profound as anything else. Because, in fact, you look at him, he doesn't have a sling on his head, he looks nice, he talks well, even though he has some difficulty with word finding, you aren't going to hear it if you have just a casual conversation. So all of these aspects are very much involved in handling these cases.
Why do medical personnel often miss a mild brain injury if it's so common?
They come in and the question is this a life-threatening injury? And it isn't a life-threatening injury in an immediate sense. The person who's there is not going to die if they have a negative CAT scan, and Michael will talk about that, and that's generally all they do. They're going to send him home, but they'll send him home with a warning and saying if you get nauseous or you get vertigo or if you get confused at home, come on back. But really what happens in these cases as we see them often is the people who come in to you don't know what they have. People don't know they don't know that they have these injuries and they don't want to accept it. Take Jerry. He does not. He came into me and there's no way in heck he had a brain injury. It was just simply that he had a friend who had told him, you better look into this right away. He got a lawyer because his friend had said, you need to do this. He showed up at my office. He feels different. He's got this different feeling, and we go through all of these symptoms, and we have a whole list of these symptoms that occur with brain injury that we look for. And I even had Jerry fill out a form for me a couple days ago as to these symptoms. It's very interesting. He still has a sense of humor, and his wife, Carolyn, who has been 90% of people who have brain injuries, their marriages don't survive or their relationships don't survive. That is a huge loss. A huge, I mean 90, 95%, it's in that area. That is perhaps the most significant loss in mild traumatic brain injury, mild quote unquote. It is a life-threatening situation, but how do you prove it? How do you prove it to that and not some prior fact in an environment in which lawyers are looked at as greedy, clients are looked at as greedy, and the symptoms aren't visible? It's a real issue.
Michael Harris.
Yes.
What sorts of physical forces cause the most severe brain injuries?
Essentially, the most devastating type of force that's exerted on the brain is what we call rotational force. If you were to take a boxing match as a typical example of an event where somebody's actually being hit in the head, well, if you hit a person in the head, in the forehead, that's called it's exerting a force through the forehead in a direct line into the brain, and that's called a transitional force. The most devastating forces that are exerted on the brain from a brain injury point of view are what we call rotational forces, where a person is hit from the side of the head, and actually I was real interested as you were describing how you were hit, Jerry, where the head is spun around. I think the easiest way to think of the brain, and it really is, it's a marvelous piece of equipment, but it's like a big bowl of jelly, and when it comes down to it. And the two main parts of the brain that are of interest to this question are what we call the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter is the cortical brain, and it's kind of like the hard drive in your computer. And the white matter, if you think of the white matter, we refer to them as axons. The axons are the cables and wires that connect the hard drive to the rest of your head. Well, the white matter weighs less than the gray matter does. So when you are, your head is hit from the side and you receive a rotational force, or your head is spinning, this white matter, which weighs less than the gray matter, is actually moving at a slower rate than this heavier gray matter. And so what you end up with is, in our field, we're looking for what we refer to as shear forces. And where there's a gray-white junction, where the gray matter is immediately adjacent to the white matter, you get a shearing away of those little connections, those little axons. So, and those can be microscopic. We have billions and billions of brain cells and axons in our head. And so depending on how many of those wires and what wires are cut, it can be very, very devastating.
If you have the rotational forces and some of the wiring, to put this in really basic terms, is bruised or torn, what sort of everyday symptoms might be indicative of mild brain injury?
The typical symptoms, once again, if you think that the wires that have been cut, and I like to call them wires because it really is that simple. If you want to talk medicalese, you can get very complicated, but it really is wires. If the brain wants to do a function that needed to pass through or through those particular cables and wires, now the brain has to reroute that information. It has to go around the area that's been severed. So the typical symptoms are, and it's very tiring to have to do that. You typically see fatigue in a person. They'll tell you they're very tired. Headaches are another thing. This overloading of this brain that's now damaged, accomplishing the same purpose that it wanted to accomplish before, is tiring. People talk about headaches, they talk about all kinds of symptoms like that. And depending on where it is, a person can end up with vertigo. I'm always looking for symptoms like vertigo. Vertigo involves the inner ear, but it can also involve the brain.
What about relationships?
Interestingly enough, relationships tend to not start to dissolve for many months later. In fact, you're looking at 3 to 4 5 months later, things really start to unravel in the family. And it's the family members who are saying, my significant other, my family member isn't like they used to be. And the reason is because after an injury, people get a lot of credit. You know, they're hurt, and so we'll give them there's a lot of leeway provided these people. And so that when 3 or 4 months go by, then people get tired of that, and they start looking at, well, why isn't this person getting well? So those symptoms oftentimes don't occur for months later. Delayed.
Tell us about your experience in finding an attorney and going to court.
Well, the attorney part was, my wife was contacted by a friend, and which knew Dave Goldin, and that's how she connected with that. And in the beginning, it was, you know, just making sure that I was going to recover and there was no problems. And Dave helped in that fashion as far as finding doctors and experts that we could go to make these things clearer.
Sure.
And it's when the other attorneys got into it, then I started jumping through hoops.
What is the place of neuropsychological testing?
One thing I might comment on, the defense will sometimes say, well, this guy's malingering. He wants money, and he's malingering, and they use what's called an MMPI test to prove that, right? Well, MMPI tests are normed not against brain-injured people, and the truth of the matter is, if you have somebody who's brain-injured, who has real deficits, and who's reporting those deficits honestly in the MMPI, it's going to show them off the map because they're being normed against, they're being compared against a normal population. So you have to have a neuropsychologist who's very sensitive to this, and not only is sensitive to that, but who can bring in the whole environment, who can show the interrelationships between the various different people and talk to the witnesses, and who can make your case not just by saying, well, this test shows this and he's in this percentile and this test shows that and he's in that percentile, but basically be part of a team that talks about, yes, this is the type of deficit he had as I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so, as well as it shows up on the test right here, and this is why it shows up, and this is what these test results mean.
Frontal lobe is what defines us as Homo sapiens. It's executive function. It allows my daughter to decide, well, I'm going to work really hard for 4 years in high school because I want to go to that college. And the testing that neuropsychologists do, they test memory, they test concentration, they test a lot of things, but they don't test very well this very abstract thing called frontal lobe and executive function. The very function of the neuropsychologist asking the question is acting as the person's frontal lobe, because do this, do that, give me this response. So that does not get tested, and does not get tested very well.
We have a number of brain injury survivors in the audience today, and perhaps we could take some questions. If any of you have questions for our speakers or for Mr. Gilb.
They only treated my spinal injury, and it was sometime later that they caught the brain injury, and I'd already settled for just the spinal thing, you know, so that's all over. But the irony is I was a motivational speaker, you know, making $100,000 plus a year, and I've ended up with an affect disorder where my emotions don't show on my face a lot of times, and you know, I guess it's textbook. Marriage dissolved, business dissolved. You know, the kids are been taken away from me.
Is it ever too late in a situation like this to file a lawsuit? Are there statutes of limitation, preserving evidence? Are there issues like that?
Well, actually, it's a simple and a complicated question because the typical statute of limitations, at least in California, is a 1-year statute of limitations. In other states, I think it's Nevada and Washington, we have 2-year and 3-year statute of limitations. There's an issue as to competence, and there's some law that discusses if a person's incompetent, then a statute is told for a period of time. I don't know, David might be able to comment on that.
In a malpractice context, medical malpractice causes a brain injury. You may have a period of time where you continue treating with that doctor and the statute doesn't begin to run, or where you don't realize that there was malpractice and the statute doesn't begin to run. But in the typical trauma setting where somebody is brain injured, there's usually some significant other around who's competent.
You could look at tissue that they couldn't see 4 years ago, 3 years ago, and see what we refer to as hemosiderin or gliosis. So you say, what good would that do? It wouldn't do you any good in your lawsuit because your lawsuit's gone. But if there's disability issues, Social Security issues, once you have a hemorrhage and what we refer to as the gray matter of the brain, that hemorrhage fully develops at the end of 6 months, and that hemorrhage and that what we call hemosiderin is there for the rest of your life.
If you were to represent me in court, how would you convince a jury that I am neither developmentally disabled or crazy?
Well, I wouldn't try to convince them that you were developmentally disabled or crazy. I would try to relate it to some trauma that you'd suffered in some way that would be compensable. Because, in fact, in order to proceed in court, you have to have some trauma that relates to somebody else's responsibility or accountability.
I went with a friend of mine to her trial, and she had spent about 8 years in recovery and was at a pretty good point. And I sat in with her at the trial, and the opposing lawyer systematically destroyed her credibility. And I wonder what the cost is there. She didn't win the case, but even if she had won the case, she had a tremendous setback in terms of her self-esteem and her identity that she had and others had spent time helping her to rebuild. So basically, I guess my question is, where do you get a strong advocate to go with you? And if you don't have a strong advocate, does that portend to a poor outcome?
Well, first of all, I don't think perhaps your friend should have been in court the whole time. I take it you're talking about a trial, and normally, especially with someone who looks as good as someone like Jerry, I would not have them sitting in the court, because the jurors get then very much more familiar with what they think looks okay. So not only from the standpoint of not subjecting somebody to all of this terrible maligning, if you will, would I not have that person in court, but probably for other reasons that are otherwise strategic. And one of the things I was mentioning, malingering and the defense that they're use these tests for that purpose. I mean, I think one way you can turn these things around, and you can talk to the jury about the fact that not only did they deny their responsibility for this accident, not only are they unwilling to be accountable, but now they want to brand this man as a liar. So they're not only happy with not giving him any award, but they want him to now have to walk out on the streets of San Diego or wherever as a liar because he's misrepresenting. You know, and if you've built up credibility, I don't really think you build up credibility by who's in court with you. I think what you do is you build up credibility by finding the people who knew him before and after, and making sure that you're comfortable with these people coming into court and talking about, yeah, Jerry was like this before, now he's like that. And these people are not, in many instances, family, because family is going to say that, and certainly they aren't the client. I mean, you don't really need, I don't really want Jerry to get on the stand and say, well, I suffer from this, I suffer from that. I'd much rather Jerry got on the stand and said, you know, I tried to go down to, I went down to the Aerospace Museum, I went to the Automobile Museum, and I did volunteer work for them. I tried to do it, and I enjoyed it a great deal, and this happened, right? And then call the people from the Aerospace Museum and just have them describe how his face got red when he tried to do this, and he tried so hard and couldn't do it. I want to put him on to talk about what he's trying to do. And I really tell you, the name of this is credibility. because I don't even talk to clients about money. I talk to them about how are you going to get better? How are you going to get better? And let's try, because in trying to get better, you prove that they've got brain injuries if they can.
If a family has someone in the family who recently has received a brain injury and they're thinking about going to court, do you have any words of advice about picking an attorney, or whether they should do that? Have you had second thoughts about having gone to court and fought the legal battle?
No, I haven't had any second thoughts about it. I think it all was necessary, and I was very fortunate to have a friend that knew Dave. So they all can't know Dave, I guess. But I think obviously that programs like this is going to make it more aware for other people to know that it's going to require an attorney that basically would specialize in this, because it does require a whole lot of detail effort on their part, on the attorney, to dig into the case. It isn't one that's an open book, obviously.
Right. It's obviously a specialty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for appearing today. Gentlemen, one last question, briefly. It sure seems like there would be easier law to practice than the law that you practice. These are difficult cases, and the way you've described it today, it seems like an uphill battle winning these cases. David Goldin, why do you stay in this area of law?
A wonderful opportunity to see people who are as courageous as Jerry and the others who have gone through this process, who keep on fighting, who keep on saying, maybe I am a different person, but I'm going to be the best different person you ever saw, and maybe I'm not. And it's just exhilarating to see the courage that people who suffer this injury have and demonstrate on a regular basis, and keeps me interested. I've done this stuff a long time, and I'm much more interested in my practice now than I was 10 years ago, before I really was heavily involved in this. So it's a real opportunity for me as well.
The first case I really got into was a minor, 16-year-old minor who, her mom was an attorney who referred me his daughter, and he said, well, she seems okay to me, and the mother says, no, she's not the same at all. And in fact, she was, all her rest of her friends were going to UC colleges and USC and everywhere, and she was just floundering. And so I decided back then I just didn't understand enough, so I read everything I could possibly read. I read up on MRIs, I read up on everything, and when I got into it, I realized what this young woman had lost, and it just changed my life.
Thank the three of you very much for appearing today and for sharing your information with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like more information, please click to our website at www.sdbif.org or call us at 619-294-6541.